formerly the Additional Chief Secretary to the Government of Karnataka and advisor to Dayanand Sagar University.
Thank you,
Mr. Jairaj. Good
Hello,
day.
General. I know the General, Dean, and I greatly impressed by his many contributions to our country and his great qualities of head and heart.
Thank you, sir.
So looking forward to hearing you, General, on leadership.
Thank you very much. Will do. Naga, just checking up that video. I hope Imtiaz is ready with that.
Yes, Imtiaz will be ready with it, sir. Professor Rajan, you can just talk to Imtiaz.
Yes, sir. I'll just do it right away. Yeah.
Thank you.
Dean,
So,
is it a good thing for us to mute both our video and audio?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
So I'm on mute, okay?
Thank you, sir. Welcome to the Distinguished Speaker Series brought to you by Executive Education, Dayanand Sagar University, Bangalore. I would like to welcome Major General George to this gathering. He will take you through leadership lessons for a VUCA world. As you know, we live in a volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous world. And who better to speak on it but an armed forces general? Major General George is an alumnus of the National Defense Academy and was commissioned into the infantry in 1974. Over 37 years of an illustrious career and varied experience, he has been part of the Indian peacekeeping force in Sri Lanka, served on the Siachen Glacier and in counter-insurgency areas of the Northeast. He commanded a counter-insurgency force in North Kashmir and was the chairman of the Ceasefire Monitoring Group in Nagaland immediately after his retirement from the Indian Army. My co-hosts for this evening are my fellow professors and colleagues, Commander Joshi, formerly of the Indian Navy, and he was an aviator in the Navy, and Dr. Rahul Dige, who teaches supply chain management and innovation. I will now hand over quickly to Dr. Dige to take you through the, if I can call it that, the rules of the webinar, and then he will hand over to Commander Joshi. Once again, a warm welcome to Major General George to this webinar, and it's a pleasure, an honor, and a privilege to have you here, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Captain.
Thank you, Captain. Once again, warm welcome to everyone. We are going to have a very interesting and insightful evening. I'll just spell out a couple of do's and don'ts. As always, we will use the Zoom chat window for taking questions. I request everyone to refrain from posting anything else in that chat window so that we only look at the questions there. My co-host, Commander Joshi, will read out the questions at the end of the discussion to Major General George, and he can answer those questions. So I'll keep this brief. I'll hand it over to Commander Joshi. Thank you.
Thank you, Dige sir, and welcome General George sir for this wonderful evening that we are expecting. And there are a lot of expectations and a lot of anticipation in this particular event, that we have got some 40 odd years of military experience on that side of the screen. The people are wanting to throw questions the moment you start off, but as Dige sir has just now explained, kindly do not do that. I will compile all your questions and send them across to the general once his talk is over, and after that he would choose out of those questions. He would pick up some 5-8 odd questions and answer them. That is it. Thank you. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Commander Joshi. Good evening, everybody. Let me start by saying that I am privileged to be here to be able to communicate with you. Just unfortunate that the present situation does not provide us the opportunity of, being in a single room and sharing experiences together. But We will manage, we will adapt. That's the requirement of the day. My special thanks to Captain Nagaraj for having invited me to be part of this session. Thank you very much. Let me start by saying that I found this invitation from Captain Nagaraj to have come up at a most appropriate time. I don't need to be explaining to you what it is. I think all of you are following it up very intently. And right now, our communication, our connection itself says that this is what has come about. But let's go back a little bit in time for me to put this into context. We are in a situation where a lot has changed in the world altogether. But is it the first time? Take you back in time to look back at what we have identified as the various industrial revolutions that have taken place. Starting with the 18th century, when you had the steam engine being invented, look at what happened to manufacturing when it came to the power looms. Many of you may be familiar with what happened in the country when there were massive agitations for machined textiles coming into the country, when we were dependent solely on handlooms. You look at the 19th century, with electricity having been invented, and then you had what was probably the first assembly line production by Henry Ford. And it is said that he identified this, or he got this idea after he saw a slaughterhouse where you had animal carcasses on hooks that were being moved from one end to the other and people working on them. Move on to the 20th century, and we have a situation where partial automation has set in because of computers. And come on to the 21st century, the situation that we are in today. Technological advancement has been so huge. So today, when we talk about a digital world where we are talking about 5G and 3D printing and machine learning and artificial intelligence, business has got so affected that the need for change has become immense. There has been change all along that we've talked about, right from what I mentioned, the 18th century. But the fact is that the impact of the change is so huge, so widespread, and so fast today that the need to adapt, to change, has become an absolute necessity. It was under this circumstance that, first of all, you know, the coining of this word, this term VUCA, this is first a term coined by the US military at the end of the Cold War. You had the Soviet Union disintegrate, and then the Americans suddenly, from a bipolar world, landed up into a unipolar world with too many unpredictable areas. Whether it was the newly created Central Asian republics, some of them holding nuclear missiles, two portions in the rising China to the Middle East, and all of it created a situation where things were very unpredictable, and that is how the American military had coined this term VUCA. We'll talk about it in a little more detail later. It was a term used or initiated at that particular point in time, remained dormant, and then suddenly it is with 9/11 that the term then took prominence. Till then, business was talking about it purely because of the technological advancements that were taking place. After 9/11, suddenly you had a situation of Afghanistan and Iraq and what have you. So it was a terminology being used by the military as well as business. The technological advancements were a reality, but something like 9/11, which is being called a black swan event, you know, when I talk about black swan event, we're talking about the most unpredictable and most unexpected events that take place. So starting with 9/11, you go down to the financial crisis of 2008, and we come to COVID-19 just now. You saw what was the follow-up to 9/11. We saw what happened in 2008, particularly the United States, the massive stimulus that took place. It was a certain response by the government in place at that time, wonderfully well orchestrated, and probably the outcome has been quite positive. And now we come to today. I'm sure everybody is following it up very closely. Try considering the response of each of the governments that we have seen. Response from the United States. End result today, over 50,000 deaths. You look at what happened in Europe. You've got fatalities above 20,000 in Italy and Spain. And you look at the other examples where everybody is talking about the manner in which it has been controlled, particularly in Taiwan. You look at the Republic of South Korea. These have been quoted as classic examples. And aside, there is also reference to governance where women are in leadership role. Not a subject for discussion here, but still, I thought it pertinent to mention countries being quoted: Taiwan, New Zealand, you've got Iceland, Norway, Denmark, all of them women in leadership, and by and large known to have controlled the situation much, much better. Leave that aside. We've talked about governmental responses, and you're seeing the impact of it today. I want to bring in one example here. You've got a case of Sweden where they have fatalities, but the country has decided against a lockdown. What they have decided to do is advise social distancing, masks, and all the precautions that we are talking about.
General George, sir, sorry to interrupt. Would you like to share your PPT?
Yes, I will be. I'm coming up.
Okay, you're coming up. Okay, fine, fine.
So you compare Sweden to, let's say, India. We have had to take the step of a complete lockdown. Two extremes, two variations, we will talk about a little later. Now, with this as a backdrop, which, as far as we are concerned, whether it is governance or whether it is business, is what can be termed a perfect storm. With this as the backdrop, let's just have a look at what VUCA stands and means. We will not get involved in this terminology because it is a terminology, but what the situation means is what I have just described to you. But just because it's a terminology that everybody needs to know about, so that is why. Am I on screen with the slide?
Yes, you are. Very clear.
Okay. So just a basic interpretation of the terms of volatile. You know, imagine a kind of a chemical reaction and you don't know what the outcome is going to be, but that's what the situation is that we are talking about. When you talk about uncertain, you know, you don't have reference points from the past. So what is the future course of action? What is the direction that we need to take? All of it is quite open-ended. When you talk about complex, we are talking about layered challenges. There could be challenges because of the situation within the organization, and there are certain challenges outside of the organization. And finally, when you talk about being ambiguous, are we able to identify as to what this threat is? Are there opportunities there in front of us? Will we be able to exploit that? So that is what the term VUCA is referring to. Like I said, we won't delve too much into the terminology, but I'm sure with what I talked about earlier, to put things into context, this is what the situation is all about. Now, I talked about governments and I talked about what were the kind of decisions that were taken. Let's move into the business side of things. There is an organization called InnoSight. I don't know if anybody has heard of it. This is a management consultancy firm in Massachusetts in the US. They carry out a study of the companies listed by Standard & Poor and the Forbes 1000 companies. Now, out of this large package, they have been trying to identify as to which are the companies that have been able to adapt to change. I'm going to give you now, the 2017 study identified 10 companies. The 2019 study identified 20 companies. The assessment by Harvard Business Review is that the numbers who have been able to upgrade to be able to respond to the challenges have increased. And with the result, the scores were so close that what was 10 companies in 2010, they have increased and grouped 20 companies into it. Now, these are the top business transformations identified by InnoSight. I just picked up a few random ones. Danish oil and natural gas is ranked 7 in that list of 20. But they're talking about a classic case of the company being in the dumps in 2012. A huge financial crisis, huge debt, and primarily due to gas prices having dropped by 90%. Now, in a situation like that, the board hires a new CEO by the name of Henrik Paulsen, who is an executive with Lego. When Lego, the executive, comes in there, well aware of what the challenges, and this is the point that we just talked about, as to, in an ambiguous situation of this variety, do I see an opportunity, or is it a standard procedure of me having to, like you have when a new boss comes in, you look at how do I scale down, start laying off people, look at scaling up production, and look at a kind of an incremental growth. Now, here was somebody who decided on a fundamental change. One is their core business being oil and gas. He decides to go in and support sustainable growth, to go into the area of offshore wind energy. Now, remember that offshore wind energy was considered, or at that time, was more than double the cost of onshore wind energy. But he took the decision of getting into the area of offshore wind energy. He had huge farms come up and was able to leverage the kind of technology required, the team required, and plenty of the people who are into oil and gas were actually redeployed. And he also went into a change of name. On that slide, you would have seen an arrow that showed Ørsted. Now, Ørsted is the name of a Danish scientist who had, identified the principles of electromagnetism. So he gave it a new identity, and this kind of a redeployment And then the rest, like they say, is history. Let me come to a few other cases that I have listed out. I'm quoting Netflix now, because these are people who have really been able to transform themselves. In 2013, Netflix was only into content distribution. The CEO suddenly decides that at this rate, we are in no position to compete with Microsoft and Google and Amazon and each of these people, and decided on a quantum change. And that is when they went into creating original content and distributing it. Profits multiply 32-fold and a compounded annual growth rate of 57%. Look at Philips, largely into lighting. They made a shift, went into healthcare technology. Siemens, like you see on the slide, from oil and gas, suddenly go into smart infrastructure and renewable power storage and distribution. The 2 points listed below, one is the point about moving from maximizing shareholder value to serving society, was the point taken up by Netflix. And similarly, when it came to decision making, out from the center to be delegated to every business unit, was a conscious decision made by Siemens. Now, these were the kind of business changes that took place. We will be talking about why a little later, but from governance to business. The point I want to highlight is everything was a case of leadership. Technology is, scaling up at an immense rate, but leveraging the technology, getting the best out of it, everything boils down to leadership. That's what we're going to be talking about. Now, during this,
if I may interrupt you for a moment, General,
yes.
A lot of your audience are keen to know how, in your experience as a soldier, this VUCA has come into play in your role as a soldier, right from the time you joined and maybe possibly towards the evening of your tenure over there. This is what the feedback that I'm receiving over here.
Okay, can you give me just maybe another 5 minutes, because I've got that as a separate slide and it's just coming up.
All right.
Okay, so it's coming up, not to worry. But I just wanted to bring this into a certain flow. So since we talked about leadership at governance and business level, there is a particular book I heard about, and then I saw the video. It's called 5 Minds of the Future. We'll just have a brief video come up. I want to tell you as to how it fits into preparing leaders, whether military or business. Can I request for that video to come up, please?
Imtiaz, can you play it?
I want to talk now about, finally, the things I've been thinking about recently, building on my work in education, building on my work on excellence. One thing I've been thinking about is what kind of minds do we need to have going forward in the future? And I've written a book called 5 Minds for the Future, in which I describe 3 cognitive areas and 2 human areas where I think we need to focus our education in the future. The cognitive areas are the disciplined mind, what it means to become truly expert in an area. The synthesizing mind, how we put things together which are disparate, which don't necessarily immediately call themselves to be combined, but which need to be integrated if we're to understand them and if we're to communicate them to other people. And when we live at a time when we're deluged with information of all sorts, much of which of quite poor quality, the capacity to synthesize is tremendously important. The third kind of cognitive mind is the creating mind, the mind that thinks outside the box, that comes up with new ideas, with new practices. It's great to think outside of the box, but you can't think outside of the box unless you have a box. And the box is the discipline and the synthesizing which you've done before you can be generally creative. The last two kinds of minds have to do with the human sphere. I call them the respectful mind and the ethical mind. The respectful mind recognizes that we have tremendous diversity in the world, indeed tremendous diversity in any community of any size. I hardly need to talk about that in India, which is as diverse a society as exists. And when people look and behave differently from us, we can try to kill them, we can ignore them, we can tolerate them, or we can try to work with them. And clearly, it's best for the world if we respect one another despite these differences, maybe even because of these differences. The ethical mind is the mind which asks not just what rights do I have, human beings are very good nowadays at stating their rights, but also what are our responsibilities, what are our duties. And I'm particularly interested in our responsibilities as workers. If you are a professional of some sort, educator, doctor, engineer, architect, lawyer, what are your responsibilities? And if you're a citizen of a community, a state, a nation, a region, the entire world, what are your responsibilities? And the ethical mind doesn't always get it right, but it thinks a great deal about what it means to be a responsible worker and a responsible citizen.
Okay, coming back online, I got the question. I'm not going to take too much of time on this. I just want to summarize what we saw just now. You know, when I spoke about leadership, I was talking about leadership, which includes advisors, the credibility of the leader, and social capital. I'm cutting down on what I intended speaking just because I think we may be running short of time. But this was with the backdrop of both governance and business communities. Now, what you saw on the video just now, I'm summarizing again, but what Howard Gardner had talked about was a disciplined mind, a synthesizing mind, a creative mind, respectful and ethical. Now, the first three, like he mentioned, are part of the cognitive mind, and the other two are, you know, indicative of the human element to it. Let me proceed and talk about what I think everybody wanted. That's the question that I got. So let me come to the lessons from the Army. How is it that we prepare, the Army prepares people for the kind of environment that we are talking about? You know, the moment you come in, the first thing is, let me talk about the selection process itself. Compared to anywhere else in business, probably the one area where greater focus is much more on the individual and the personality rather than his IQ or competence at that stage, because the Army is convinced that the time that you come in under training is when you get prepared for it. So that is how you select a person and bring him in. And right from the beginning, it is extremely close mentoring that takes place. Now, we have a system in a combat unit wherein you come in new as a lieutenant, and you have the person who's immediately superior to you, who acts as what used to be called a senior subaltern, who is actually controlling you, guiding you, channelizing you every step of the way till your turn comes to mentor the next person who comes in. I just talked about the selection process and the mentoring. This focus on progressive expertise and primary skills that we are talking about, I'm taking you to the 5 minds of the future, where you talked about a need for a certain level of expertise, which is part of that disciplined mind. Now here, it is talking not just about, many may be having an impression of just a weapon that is there with a person, but remember the spectrum is so wide that the number of weapons you employ, the manner in which you employ them, and the tactics that go beyond it as part of every operation is immense. I'm talking about varied operational and functional environments in which you are. Now, this is where I think the question comes. So this is where let me look at you and speak. I would like everybody to remember that when we talk about being in different operational and functional areas, you are talking about people have to get familiar, get competent. From the deserts of Rajasthan to the plains of Punjab, to the mountains of Kashmir, extremely high altitudes like the Siachen Glacier. You move into the altitudes and jungles of Arunachal Pradesh. And then when you talk about insurgency areas, you are talking about fighting in built-up areas. Now that is the kind of experience and expertise that people are put through. Since there was a specific question about personal experience and how would I fit into a situation like this, let me tell you that I landed up as part of the Indian peacekeeping force in Sri Lanka in a logistics assignment where you are provisioning people right from ammunition to weapons to food and clothing and everything. Now imagine a situation where every convoy of yours that is going to supply people who are spaced out in distances in terms of 15, 20, 25 kilometers, literally at a particular point in time, literally every convoy that moves with supplies is getting ambushed by the LTTE. You are having casualties who need to be tended to, casualties who may be in a condition where you can have road evacuation, but there are others who need helicopter evacuation. Imagine creating an area where you can get them to land come and pick them up. So, I'll give you a specific example now. The entire headquarters had to relocate from a particular point north of Trincomalee, take a circuit of close to 80 kilometers or so to relocate to the southern part of Trincomalee for operational reasons. You've got a convoy that has got close to 120 odd vehicles of different units going together. One stretch of maybe about 35 to 40 kilometers on a main highway, plenty of traffic, protective elements are all over. And then you get into an absolute jungle area. Now, when I talk about jungle area, I'd like you to, you may not be able to comprehend. You get to know about it only if you fly over it in a helicopter, and you will not be able to see the ground for scores of kilometers, square kilometers. You will not be able to see the ground. That's how dense the canopy is. Now you're moving on a Kacha road through that to move to your next location. You have protective elements, troops who are moving ahead of you to check out that there are no IEDs, there are no mines laid, and they keep progressively moving. So they would have started a few hours before us, even if before it was first light. But it's a very slow and a deliberate process. Now suddenly you reach a point where that protective element is there. The officer leading tells you, I have not been able to clear the rest of it. Now it's your call. Now imagine you have got a convoy of 100 plus vehicles. A lot of them are administrative elements. You have got troops protected, but they are limited in number. You've got a choice. Do I pitch camp there itself? Now you are on a road. The Sri Lankan army had cleared maybe 15 feet or so on either side, because otherwise somebody could get picked off that road and you would not know as to where that person has gone. So about 15 to 20 feet may have been cleared where you've got it open, and after that the dense jungle starts. Your call. Do I stop there for the night because the rest of the area has not been protected? Or It has not been protected. Let me do whatever modification to the column, see how I can do it, take it and get there before it gets dark. Because if you are caught in the open, when you do not have adequate protection under darkness, it is going to be an immense challenge. Well, took the decision, personally pick up a protective element, move ahead, get the column to follow, and then you get there in time. So this is just one example I gave you. Let me give you a peacetime example. I think we're running short of time. A peacetime example in a place like Bhuj. I don't know how many of you heard of it. There were trucks that were carrying scrap metal. We were importing, China and India were importing massive scales of scrap metal for our requirements. So they used to get loaded into trucks and go all over the country. One such truck loaded with scrap of this variety from Kandla, and somewhere in Haryana, there was a massive explosion. That's when people woke up to it. And then when you inspected the scrap that was being collected in Kandla port, this was scrap coming from the Middle East, Iran-Iraq war, and those places. A whole lot of unexploded bombs were part of that scrap. Suddenly, people examined the pile and you realized that there were plenty of unexploded bombs. The civil government, the civil administration was in a huge quandary. Now in Bhuj, you are the commander. You get a call that this is what the crisis is. You've got a situation that is very, very volatile. If I have to go through the process of asking for sanction to be able to do something about it, you can be sure that it has to go to the army headquarters, it has to go to the ministry. From the ministry, you can be sure that there will be people checking, and by the time you get a clearance for it, you don't know how long it's going to take. Civil administration took on the challenge. The police picked up, under supervision by one of the officers I sent. You created stacks because there's a technical layout for all of it that our ordnance person could do. Get it all stacked, and then, no doubt about it, I got a rap for it because the clearance was not taken. But then you've got a situation. I mean, this is what I'm talking about. Imagine if you had explosions taking place in Kandla port with bombs like that. But these are some of the many, many situations that you can land up in where you've got the challenge of having to respond and you have to do something about it. Okay, let me proceed. Commander Joshi, in case there is anything beyond that as we go along. Sorry for the...
I think he may be speaking on mute. I think we should be good to go ahead.
Okay, okay. So I talked about the varied. Now I'm putting down a few of these points because I'm following it up with a white paper that I went through, which was talking about countering the VUCA environment, and that is how I'm trying to relate it. Now in the army, I'd like you to know that officers are constantly changing roles. So what it means is you are into different functional areas. I talked about a logistics role in Sri Lanka. So you are a combat infantryman, but you can be an instructor somewhere, you can be a logistician, you can be an operational guy on staff. A whole lot of all of this exposure is provided to you to prepare you for the future. I bring in the leadership development part because, again, when we talk about what should HR be looking at when it comes to preparing or selecting and preparing people, I just thought that I should tell you about how the army does it. We have plenty of what are called war games and sessions of that variety, where I'd like you to always factor that when you are preparing leaders in the army, you are always pitting two parties against each other. So you are always trying to get into the head of the person who's been identified to be across the border. That is why we have serious intelligence effort at getting to try and study the personalities who are in leadership across, just to be able to identify how would a person react in a particular situation. So the point I was coming to is you try and get people into simulated scenarios, war games, where you are getting people to think beyond what they had been familiar with. Leave you with a last point, and that is that everybody retains an identity in a combat infantry unit. What it means, if we have the time, we will talk about it a little later. I need to move on to what I told you was the white paper that I mentioned. Now, this is a white paper that is analyzing the VUCA environment, and they have offered solutions to the VUCA environment, which they have termed as VUCA Prime. What is it? For each of the terms of volatile, they have identified vision as the counter to it, the antidote to it, which is an ability to focus on the long term, to be able to create leaders with that vision. A level of understanding. So what was called uncertain, they have coined the term understanding, which is for you to be able to understand the functional area that you are in and to be able to look beyond it. Clarity for the complexity that was talked about in VUCA. This is to be able to identify detail in chaos. And then where it was ambiguous, you are talking about agility and timely response. Now, each of these terminologies, again, will require time to be able to sit and discuss these. But I just thought I should be able to tell you as to what is it that leadership should be trying to identify to be able to meet up with the kind of requirement that we are discussing just now. And so, we come to what we are calling as leadership development. Now, this is what I told you about how the army was doing it. This is what this white paper has advised and recommended for leadership development in business. And the first point is regarding hiring of leaders. Now, this is where I'll try and draw parallels again to what I spoke about the army. The hiring process. Today, too often, when you see placement interviews taking place, by and large, a knowledge content. I guess the ability to have a kind of a selection process like the armed forces have may not be practical here. But then the point being recommended is, now I'm sorry, it's a white paper. I'm not able to give credits to whosoever has identified all this, but there are takeaways from the Boston Consulting Group and a few others that have been referred to. But here, what they are talking about is to be able to assess this agility as part of an interview process, creating situations, work experience of yours from the past. Where was it that you were able to respond to a particular situation where there was maybe a lack of information and there was confusion? Where was it that you were able to take the initiative and do something? Create a kind of a situation where you're putting somebody into a simulated environment for him to be able to respond to certain questions. So essentially talking about a selection process that can be improved to be able to get the kind of quality that you require. Next is, you've already got existing leaders. How do you train them to be agile? Again, I take you back to what I was talking about the army. You know, you've got the army provided you situations of operating in different environments, operational environments, where this ability to take a risk is there, because too often when you take the initiative, you had to be able to take a certain risk. Without that, it gets to be very difficult. So just what I mentioned about wargaming and stuff like that, you have to be able to simulate, you have to be able to create situations. And one point I would like to leave you with, because I was associated with a little bit previously, is experiential learning. The principle behind it is this: when you have people, an entire team or a leadership in a familiar environment, responses that you can expect from them will by and large be on familiar lines. But if you take them to an unfamiliar environment, the chances of getting natural responses out of them will be huge. And that is why I know that plenty of companies have it, but then by and large, those outings end up in resorts where it is fun and games. But there is great opportunity to be able to develop a whole lot of all of these skills through experiential learning outside. So I'm leaving you finally to close up in time with my 45-minute allotted time is what can be, I'm just summing up what could be a future business model, is that the immediate requirement or the great requirement is agility and adaptability. Two terms: ability to adapt to changing situations, mental agility to be able to make the most out of it. I'm taking the Siemens point. It is something that is a reality today, whether it is in the armed forces or whether it is outside. Armed forces were all along trained, organized, armed, equipped for large number of troops getting across a border like, say, to the western Pakistan. But the moment we went into Sri Lanka and suddenly realized that when you are able to operate only in small teams, you get into that jungle and you probably cannot see the third person that you had, you are leading. How do you connect with them? It is impossible to connect with everybody with your team that you're leading, which means per force, you have to be able to brief people well before you leave. And after that, it is decision being decentralized at the lowest of levels. Business today is adapting in a manner, I gave you those examples of Siemens and Netflix and everybody. Per force, decentralization and empowerment of subordinates is the key. I end with that, and I'm open to any question that anybody may have. Thank you.
Commander Joshi?
Maybe there is some audio difficulty, so I will ask one question that is here in the chat window.
Yes, please.
Going back to the point that you made earlier about India being locked down and Sweden, if you could elaborate on that, the differences between the way the two countries have handled the situation.
General George, could you hear him?
General George, could you hear my question?
I think we lost him for a minute.
Okay, we'll just wait for him to join back.
Just a minute, please. Sir, would you, Jairaj sir, would you like to say a few words and share your experience of leadership? You'll have to unmute.
Yeah, hi. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Loud and clear.
Wonderful. No, I really appreciate what General has said, but maybe you should complete his schedule of questions and answers, Dean, and then I will speak about my perspectives of leadership in the public domain. Okay? Can you hear me, Dean?
I'm afraid he's got some power issue maybe, so he's logged off for a slight. He'll come back. So
Okay.
till then, can you sort of
Yeah.
enlighten us, sir?
So, I was listening with great interest about what General George to say about how the army prepares its leaders and the kind of extensive training, mentoring, which goes on. And I was trying to compare it with what happens in the public domain, specifically, let's say the IAS, for instance, which is the premier administrative service in India. I don't think there is any conscious attempt to develop leadership among those who join the IAS. What happens is that, like the Indian Military Academy, we have the National Academy of Administration where people are sent for 2 years after selection. There, the focus is only on, constitution and public policy, public administration, economics, law, and so on. But at least as far as I know, there is no special component of leadership, team building, conflict management, etc., unless it started now. Okay, maybe it started now. But what happens is in the second part of the training, there was a kind of a component from IIM Ahmedabad that focused on all these issues that I mentioned, but that was brief, maybe a couple of weeks, and it was a kind of module that was given. I think following from the Indian Civil Service, the trainees are expected to pick up leadership skills by observing the performance of those who they are attached to at the district level and looking at what actually are the requirements of leadership at various levels of government when they are made understudy to these people. So it's kind of observation that has to develop leadership. But overall, if I may say so, I think the IAS is lacking in leadership. They may have adequate authority, but the exercise of authority, the kind of team building that is required, how to take people together, adhering to your point of view in a democratic, non-authoritarian fashion, that, to my mind, is lacking. And that is why administrative action appears to be so weak many a time. Now, I was wondering that, the army kind of system is a command and control system. How much that command and control has to do with leadership? Because adherence to authority, which is a requirement in a non-military setup, is very difficult, as we all know. But in the military setup, adherence to authority is almost automatic. If so, what are we talking about? What are we comparing? Is that comparison valid? That's number one. Number two, today, this kind of military ethos in which people want to join and want to participate, I think that's declining today because of the attractiveness of various other civilian occupations. So in that context, what lessons does this have as a kind of universal appeal for society? That is something that we should debate. But overall, it is important. I have seen this in, what I noticed from leaders like General George and others is, well after they leave the army, what they have embedded in them is a sense of personal discipline, time adherence, absolutely focusing on issues and getting things done. That, I think, is the final contribution which the army or the defense forces make towards individuals. And that I would like to see in other walks of life also, as to whether we have that. Those are some of the preliminary, impressions I have. And overall, I'd like to compliment Dean Nagaraj Subbarao on these extension lectures that you organize from such eminent people. And I'm sure that all the 109 participants who are here will have a lot to take away and reflect on the leadership lessons that they have heard from General George. Thank you, Dean.
Thank you very much, sir, for those enlightening words on leadership in the civil services. General Jairaj, sir, in many ways is our mentor at the university. And his question is there a difference in leadership in the military world and in the civil world? What is your opinion?
There definitely is a difference. And Mr. Jairaj had just now mentioned about, there is no formalized training in the civil services. I must tell everybody here that as long as I was in service, particularly in your earlier years, nobody talked leadership. Nobody talked team building. Nobody talked conflict management. But the moment I stepped out of uniform and got involved in a couple of places in terms of corporate training and things like that, the only talk is leadership, team building, and conflict management. And then you got thinking as to why. The opportunity to train and practice is from day one in the army. The day you joined the academy, subsequently, a term that I heard is what was called leadership through followership. I may not have a position, I may not have a rank, but every bit that you contribute, because after all, what the academy and the army is telling you from day one is this: you as an individual are inconsequential. You as an individual that is part of a wheel, you as a single cog are hugely important, because everybody has got a part to play. Now that is something that comes into you right from the beginning, which unfortunately outside is difficult to comprehend. But there is one thing that I can try and relate, and that is, I remember reading an article which talked about every human being being a tribal at heart. What the army does to you is the feeling of a tribe. You identify not with the army as a whole. In the earliest years, you identify with a unit, the flag, the regiment I belong to. And that is so instilled in you that people do things that you would not otherwise imagine. If that identity was not there, you would not be able to do the things that people do. And that's why in that last point, when I put down about lessons from the army, I put down that business about identity. So when it comes to business, how long have you been with an organization? There is a tendency today to be constantly floating. Whereas if you are in a particular organization for some amount of time, your level of knowledge, not just of the role that you are performing, but of the organization itself, gives you a certain level of identity where your commitment grows hugely. And maybe when situations arise, you are better positioned to respond, whether it is a VUCA situation or just normal incremental growth. You probably are better off to be able to handle that situation. So that's what I wanted to talk about, the leadership part.
General, there is a question.
Okay.
Yes.
General, there's a question from one Professor Archie D'Souza, who has requested you to enlighten what will be the changes in the education system to cater to the VUCA world. Can you hear us?
Yeah. Sorry.
The changes in the education system that are anticipated to cater to the VUCA world.
I remember hearing the Dean of Imperial College London, when he spoke here in Bangalore at one of the institutes where I was, where he made a mention. Now, he had grown up in the US, and then he had been picked up and he was Dean of the Imperial College. I don't know if he's still there. He's an ethnic Indian, but the Dean there. And he talked about how in the US, 70% of learning is outside the classroom. and only 30% is within the classroom. And he said that it became a huge challenge for him to get people to understand that there is a lot more need to prepare for today's work environment, to have a lot more outside of the classroom. It may be in terms of projects, it may be in terms of experiential learning, it may be in terms of internships. But he says that in the UK and in India, we are just the opposite. That 70, or in India, I think even more than 70% is all in classroom learning. Getting outside, experiencing and getting into the real world is much, much less. So if I have to offer one solution, this is a solution which will make a big, big difference, I can assure you.
Archie, I hope he has answered your question. Sir, there's another question from Subhashmita Rath, and she wants to know whether does a leader evolve out of his or her profile, or it comes with practice and decision-making skills honed over a period of time?
Let me put it as both. There are certain basic traits instilled in each one of us. Today, they say that even before birth. Leave that aside. There are certain qualities in everybody. I may not be the most suited for a leadership role. But let me give you the example of the army again. When people are picked up, yes, there is a certain selection process that you go through. But once you come in, reality says that not everybody is made for it. I'd like you, at some stage, if you get a chance to see a fresher who comes in, and 3 years after he's passing out from the National Defense Academy, you look at that person, and it is a sea change that you cannot ever imagine. The point I'm making is the environment in which you are. You know, I may not have it all in me, but I land up in an environment that has accepted me, that has identified with me, that has coached me and trained me. You can be sure that at least as long as that individual is in that environment, you can expect a lot from him or her. You move out of that environment, because after all, what is behavior? You know, when you talk about leadership, also you're responding to a particular situation. What is leadership? It is behavior in a certain environment. So I get into a different environment. If it gets more out of me, I may be even better placed. But there is the possibility that I land up in a situation where the environment did not suit me. And maybe my responses will not be what it should be in terms of a leadership role.
Thank you, General. There's a question, General George, there's a question from my colleague, Dr. Anupama, who teaches marketing. And she says, should the government go in for conscription? And that is, should young people be selected into the armed forces for a couple of years, say like what the United States had initially or what Israel has today? Will that improve leadership skills in our youngsters? That's our question.
In principle, I would say that it is excellent. For India, for our size of population, for the kind of diversity that we have, impractical. But what I would like to offer is, you know, one is, of course, you mentioned Israel and America before Vietnam. But, you know, you'll be surprised that countries like Switzerland, who really have no threat, Sweden, they have compulsory military service purely for the point you raised, man. But I came across one of those corporate trainings again. We were doing a CSR effort for a certain NGO, and they were looking after street kids. And amongst them, I found a Westerner, a youngster. It took me by surprise, and then I went and I asked him, what is it? How are you here? So he told me the system in Austria. It is not compulsory military service, but compulsory service. So you've got the option. Do you want compulsory military service? You do a certain period. I think it is 10 months or 1 year or so. Social service in Austria, a certain period of time. Social service in certain countries with which Austria had tied up. So you go, I already connected with certain organizations, you go and do your internship out there. Now, I think that is something that is a lot more realistic for India. And the challenge that we have is, look at the doctors. After MBBS, there has been a government proposal that you do at least initially, I think it was 2 years, then you have at least 1 year of rural service. We have never been able to implement that. So the idea of military service, excellent, because the level of discipline and stuff that you can get will be much, much more. But here, if it is compulsory service also, the idea of service is what, if we can get into people, I'm sure there can be a huge difference and a huge impact as far as the country is concerned.
Thank you very much, General George. And there are numerous other questions, but in the interest of time, I think we'll have to move on. We'll have possibly another webinar sometime later. And thank you very much indeed. So thank you, General George, and all participants. And I must thank, I would like to sincerely thank Mr. Jairaj for enlightening us on leadership in a non-military setup. Lessons that we have learned today are that selection is very important, as done in the armed forces, where personality is looked at and not essentially intellect and competence at the entry level. Training is critical, and agility and adaptability are very important. Experiential learning is a must. Changing roles prepare us for a VUCA world much better, and the environment is very important. Leadership, as we teach it, is many times situational and needs to be prepared for. And I think these are very valuable lessons for us in the academic and in the business world to have learned from General George today over the last 1 hour or so. He talked about his experience in the Indian Army as well as the business world. We have 2 fantastic webinars coming up. We have Brad Fetterman, who's going to join us from Memphis in the United States. He is the CEO of PowerPoint LLC, which is a consulting company. He's going to talk on employee engagement in a VUCA world. Dr. Raj, and he's kindly agreed to speak to us on May 3rd. Brad will be speaking to us on April 30th. And these are 2 fantastic lectures. Please join us. I must thank my team for putting up these fantastic webinars. We have Commander Joshi, Dr. Rahul Dige, Professor Rajan, Arvind, Mohammad Imtiaz, Malati, and Professor Naveen Rajan. Thank you very much indeed, all of you, for being here today. And I'm signing off right now. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, sir.